Someone asks, my friend's dad just died. When I am around my friend, I don't know what to say to her. What do you say to a grieving person? Have you ever been to a funeral when someone has died suddenly and you're standing in that line and you're thinking to yourself, when I get up to the front and greet the family, what am I going to say? What am I going to say to them? What words can I give them that will help them? When we lost our son, Mark, there were probably 1,000, maybe 1,500 people that came to the front of the church and greeted us. And everyone had something to say. But there's only 2 comments I remember. And the rest, I am sure, were well-intentioned, but there's only 2 that I remember. One was from an old Baptist minister, someone I knew occasionally, sort of, but not really personally. And he came through the line and he said this to me. He said, with Jesus, like Jesus. And he walked away. I'll never forget that. With Jesus, like Jesus. In fact, that's what we put on our son Mark's grave marker. With Jesus, like Jesus. And the other one came from a woman who cared for a paraplegic. She gave her life to caring for this friend of hers who had fallen off of a ladder and became paralyzed from the neck down. And she came, she was sitting at a red light on her way to the church, and she tells the story of how she was trying to figure out what could she possibly say to us as tears were streaming down her cheeks, and maybe a little bit of fear inside of her as well, of what do I say? And she came through the line, and I'll never forget, she said this. She said, there are some wounds only heaven can heal. Now, out of the 1,500, maybe even up to 2,000 people that came through the line that day, I remember those 2 comments. With Jesus, like Jesus. And there are some wounds only heaven can heal. Now, that being said, one of the things that I'm often asked is, what do you say to someone who has suddenly lost a loved one? And you want to ask the question in such a way, and here's where the burden comes, that you don't make their pain any worse. Well, friends, there's really not much you can say that's going to make a grieving person's pain worse. But there is something that I believe will really hurt someone who has lost a loved one, and that is if you fail to even acknowledge their pain. If you are unwilling to even speak of the loved one that is deceased. Talk about that loved one. Talk about what you remember about them. Speak something about that person. Now, the grieving person may start to cry. You may think that you're upsetting them, but you're not. They're acknowledging the fact that you are acknowledging their pain, and that you remember their loved one, and that you're willing not to forget. You know, even to this day, many, many years later, after we lost our son Mark, we get tears in our eyes when someone starts to talk to us about what they remember about Mark. They're not hurting us, they're actually helping us. So speak to that loved one about the person they've lost. Speak to them about what you remember. Don't be afraid to mention the person's name or some incident you remember. We don't always have to be ingenious when we're talking to someone who's lost a loved one. I remember one fella who came to our house the day after we lost our son Mark, and he sat over in the corner of the house. Hundreds of people over the next several days walked through the house, greeting us and experiencing some of the sorrow that we were experiencing. But that young man sat over in the corner, and he kept watch. He would sit there and pray for us. He would sit there and just look at us and occasionally come over and say, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And out of all the people who came through our house over those next few days, I remember him the best. I remember watching him, keeping watch over us, a friend who was willing to just sit there and say nothing. When he did have an opportunity to speak, he would talk about Mark. He would talk about what we lost and how painful it must be for us acknowledging our pain and our sorrow. So friends, don't be afraid that you're going to say something that's going to hurt them even more than they're already hurting. And don't be afraid to speak of their loved one. If they begin to cry, if they begin to experience some sort of emotion, that's all right. And sometimes it may be just best to give them a hug, look them in the eye, and say to them, I am so sorry. I am so sorry you're going through this. Acknowledging that pain, I think, is important. Well, contrary-wise, I remember a man who came to me and was so sorrowful that we had lost our son Mark and said, I know how you feel. We had to put our dog down this morning. And I could have easily been offended by that. I could have easily looked at that and said that you're talking about an animal. You're not talking about a child. I could have easily attacked him. But I remember, and I hope you will remember, that some people will try to relate to you on whatever pain level they've experienced. And you need to acknowledge that and understand that. Even though it might be a dumb thing for them to say, even though they may lack the necessary intelligence to think it through, at least they're trying to relate their pain to your pain. And that's a good thing. So I encourage you not to be afraid of facing death and helping someone else walk through that horrible valley. Be a friend. Be a listener. Speak of that loved one. Encourage them. And don't be afraid that you're going to say the wrong thing.